There are few countries for whom the idea of a national identity is as unstable and controversial as England. After countless invasions, revolutions, wars, colonial expeditions, and cultural shifts, the only consistent characteristic of England as a culture seems to be change itself. And yet with every upset and remix there comes an attempt to define once and for all what it means to be English. The early 1970s was such a period. In 1973, nearly 12 years after submitting its application, Britain joined the European Economic Community, what would later become known as the European Union. While many saw this as an opportunity to bolster Britain's international influence, others feared for the gradual erasure of its independence within a larger European project. The country was gripped by a wave of strikes and conflict between the government and trade unions. Debates about migration had grown incredibly heated thanks to populist politicians like Enoch Powell, and as the pound's value slumped in the early months of 1973, with the Western world about to enter a 2-year-long recession, the kingdom found itself in the grips of an identity crisis. Having previously made music set in a whimsical English past, the progressive rock group Genesis now found themselves having to address this increasingly volatile present. Though they had built up quite a following in Europe, at home they were up against prog-rock powerhouses like Yes, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Pink Floyd, whose recently released Dark Side of the Moon had just redefined what a rock album could achieve. In a sense, Genesis itself was trying to figure out its own sense of identity. Rather than just producing songs that directly took on this grim social identity crisis, however, Genesis took a step sideways into a distorted world that mixes classical myth, English folklore, and contemporary culture, whilst meeting the instrumental and stylistic challenges offered by other bands. Fears about commercialisation are channeled into grotesque caricatures, national myths are satirised, conflict between urbanisation and a pastoral past dramatised, the result being their 1973 masterpiece, Selling England by the Pound. Although they're probably best known for their chart-topping pop-rock songs of the 1980s, Genesis started off as a quintessentially English group. Founded by a group of schoolboys at the elite private school Charterhouse, including core members Mike Rutherford, Tiny Banks and Peter Gabriel, the band's early years were characterised by a blend of folk and pop, growing increasingly complex both musically and lyrically as they matured, bringing in professional musicians Steve Hackett and Phil Collins in 1971 for their third album, Nursery Crime. Genesis would establish themselves as one of England's leading progressive rock groups, with their complex approaches to songwriting and instrumentation producing sprawling epics set in fantastical worlds that pushed the boundaries of what a rock song could sound like. The musical box from 1971's Nursery Crime became a stage favourite, with its creepy 12-string accompaniment setting the scene for a disturbing story of the spirit of a young boy revisiting his murderer, a little girl, when she summons him through her musical box. Foxtrot from the following year is full of narrative songs, including ones dealing with an old table's journey through time, a satirical vision of a dystopia with routine evictions and genetically engineered residents, and finishing off the album, the 23-minute epic Supper's Ready, a sprawling odyssey through different landscapes, genres and time signatures, foreshadowing their later foray into rock opera with the concept album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway in 1974. Coming off the back of a successful American tour, where the peculiar brand of folk-inflected progressive rock had hauled in a new audience, the band's label, Charisma Records, were anxious for them to capitalise on their international success with newly released material, but rather than catering especially for this new audience abroad, as their rivals Emerson, Lake and Palmer would eventually do with their arrangements of popular American tunes, Genesis decided to double down on the quintessential Englishness they had cultivated in their earlier work. The title is taken from a Labour Party manifesto, channeling anxieties about increasing globalism. The album wastes no time in establishing its theme of English identity, with the first line uttered by Gabriel effectively serving as the mission statement for the record, in the style of a bit of medieval plainsong.
Can you tell me where my country lies? Said the unicorn to his true love's eyes. It lies with me, cried the Queen of Maybe, for her merchandise he traded in his prize.
This opening track, Dancing with the Moonlit Knight, establishes a couple of core motifs that run across the album, as well as giving us the title,
Selling England by the pound.
A theme of commercialism is introduced in allusions to modern payment systems and general consumerism, all dressed up in a faux medieval romance style, with the instrumental evoking a medieval marketplace in its thickening texture of folk-inflected guitars, made to sound like harpsichords. When performing the song live, Gabriel would often dress up as Britannia, a personification of Great Britain that rose to prominence during the English Renaissance.
My name is Britannia. This is my song.
The figure became ubiquitous in British currency and in countless works of nationalistic artwork, but by the mid-20th century, after the gradual collapse of the British Empire, she had become a tired cliché. In addition to the ironic presence of Britannia, the townsfolk mourn the passing of
Old Father Thames, it seems he's drowned.
This line alludes to the classical river god tradition, with the London River having been represented as an elderly man, Old Father Thames, in multiple statues and works of art. With this figure of historical identity out of the picture, Genesis established a world rooted in tired conventions, old symbols of national pride either having expired or weakened considerably. The country is eating itself.
Digesting England by the bar.
Looking elsewhere, namely to America with its saloons and electronic payment systems, to find its identity.
There's a fat old lady outside the saloon, laying out the credit card, she plays fortune.
Indeed, the supermarket, along with its system of trading stamps, was a phenomenon initiated in America.
Knights in the Greensleeves stand and shout.
The 70s were also the golden age of advertising, as flourishing capitalism took hold of the media to embed consumerism in the popular culture and consciousness. Slogans like
You are what you eat.
"Fill the scene," positing consumer trends as methods of forging your identity. The closing track of the album, Isle of Plenty, bookends the record, with recurrent musical motifs from this first song. One of the most prominent features of the songs and the album's lyrics is the puns on British supermarket names.
Easy love, there's the safe way home. Thankful for her fine fair discount. Tess cooperates.
It's quite telling that the song, and the album, ends with Peter Gabriel reciting a shopping list containing English ribs and bird's eye dairy cream sold at cut prices. On the flip side of this aggressive Americanized consumerism, supplanting the tired figures of English culture, we get the following track, I Know What I Like. Here we follow Jacob, a simple provincial lawnmower, being pressured into adopting a modern lifestyle. The main hook encapsulates a resistant attitude towards the commercialism satirised in the opening track.
I know what I like, and I like what I know.
It captures a kind of Little England mentality, with Jacob the lawnmower resisting the calls of his friends and family to
Come up to town.
and abandon his simple countryside life. The irony of the song is in its instrumentation, however. Structurally, it's perhaps the group's most conventional song of this era, leading to it becoming their first hit single, not reflecting the kind of provincial rebellion evoked by its lyrics. Even then, aside from the droning mellotron made to sound like the lawnmower, the most distinctive feature of the song is the repetitive sitar riff, lending an Indian sound to this self-consciously English track. Now is probably a good time to talk about the album's cover. It's a pre-existing painting by the artist Betty Swanwick, who had previously produced work for Transport for London. Her distorted, surreal and often grotesque style was frequently used to depict rural, mythical scenes. Selling England's cover takes her painting The Dream, which shows a haggard figure sleeping on a park bench, resembling the speaker of I Know What I Like, whose lawnmower was added in by the artist at the request of the band, while a crowd of well-dressed civilians appear to begin a dance with one another. The sickly colours and distorted proportions establish an uneasy mood of a stagnant culture and social disrepair. From the uneasy portrait of England conjured up in the first two songs and on the album's cover, on the one hand tempted by almost predatory capitalism, on the other pastoral and humorously closed-minded, we then drift into the sublime Firth of Fifth, a pun on the Scottish estuary, the Firth of Forth. The most lyrically sparse track on the album, it stands among some of the band's best songs for its bold instrumentation, including an iconic opening piano part that is later developed as a synth, and an eerie flute melody, which is then translated into a legendary guitar solo by Steve Hackett. First conceived of by keyboardist Tony Banks for their previous album Foxtrot, the song is a showcase of the entire group's musical prowess. The unnamed hero riding through the landscape is actually secondary to the landscape itself, just as the lyrics take a backseat to the instrumentals.
A waterfall is madrigal, an inland sea is symphony.
In this track, Genesis turn their attention to the literal shifting landscape of the island, as the mythical past of England dissolves into a fluid present, stretching out into a global ocean, forgetting its grand heroic narratives to focus on the setting itself. This more natural focus, zoning in on features of the landscape, reflects the work of poets like William Wordsworth, one of the few men named England's national bard. In his work, rather than recounting the exploits of great men who can exemplify the spirit of the nation, he instead describes the landscape as an entity imbued with the spirit of the past, finding a sense of nationhood in meditative, almost pagan attitudes towards nature that connect to the spirit of the individual. Firth of Fifth also references gods, Neptune and sirens, recalling a pagan setting of ancient, in this case Greek, mythology.
Now as the river dissolves in sea, so Neptune has claimed another soul.
This is familiar territory for Genesis. Back on Nursery Crime, they told the story of the Fountain of Salmacis, a legend contained in the poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, about the young Hermaphroditus' encounter with the nymph Salmacis.
Within our hidden cave, nymphs had kept a child, Hermaphroditus, son of gods, so afraid of air.
Foxtrot, Can Utility in the Coastliners depicts the legendary English king Canute, a Danish conqueror, trying to control the waves, and Supper's Ready contains an extended sequence ripped right out of the Book of Revelations, known as Apocalypse in 9:8. Gabriel's flair for telling convoluted narratives might well have been a factor that led to his eventual departure for the group in 1974, after the concept album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. But on Selling England, he leads the bizarrely comic, mock-epic Battle of Epping Forest. At just under 12 minutes, it's the band's second longest song after Supper's Ready. While its title evokes historical conflicts like the Battle of Bannockburn, it's actually inspired by a recent gangland conflict Gabriel had read about a few years before. Like the opening of Dancing with the Moonlit Knight, it plays with our expectations about setting by introducing us to
Along the forest road, there's hundreds of cars, luxury cars.
before introducing a cast of grotesque characters drawn from the Robin Hood legend, English football, and contemporary London culture. This conflict, compared to the Civil War,
And you ain't seen nothing like it, not since the Civil War.
speaks to growing civil unrest, but its deeply sardonic, pun-ridden lyrics also reflect a sense in which England's present-day infighting, whether that be in politics or in the gangland, is a meagre shadow of its legendary past.
In with the left hook is the best no green butcher, but he's counted on the right by mixed chain gang fights. And Liquid Len with his smashed bottle men, he's lobbing Bob with a knob across the gobber.
Of all the intertextual references scattered across this era of Genesis, perhaps the most interesting are found in Selling England. The penultimate track, The Cinema Show, humorously melds characters from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet with classical mythology, all set in a modern consumerist society.
Home from work, our Juliet clears her morning meal.
The fact that it's our Juliet seems to imply a kind of collective ownership of this figure from English literature, while ironically, the character herself is taken from Italian legend. In the bridge, we're introduced to Tiresias, a figure from Greek mythology.
Take a little trip back with Father Tiresias.
Having struck a pair of mating snakes with a stick, he was punished by the goddess Hera and transformed into a woman for 7 years, before redeeming himself and being turned back to a man.
Once a man like the sea I raged, once a woman like the earth I gave.
The inclusion of this figure hints at a more fluid sense of identity, not only in terms of gender but also cultural background, as the song makes this classical past part of its miscellaneous anglicised present. This fusion of cultures, tones, styles and eras essentially forms a melting pot from which can emerge a new sense of identity. To return to the evocation of Britannia in the opening song, as the album considers England's sense of self within a flourishing international community, it's helpful to look back to the 1500s and the English Renaissance, where England as an empire was seeking to establish its presence. As statesmen and colonists sought to shape their nation's geopolitical identity, writers and artists back home were brought in to develop a cultural identity that could rival those of continental European powers like France and Italy. In the 1590s, Edmund Spenser, a member of Elizabeth I's court, wrote the epic poem The Faerie Queene. Following the adventures of knights drawn from English myth like St George and King Arthur, Spenser's poem informs a world that is part fantasy, complete with beasts, wizards and apparitions, part allegory, with multiple characters representing values like faith and justice, and part social commentary, utilising thinly veiled caricatures of Catholics and racial stereotypes. What's most peculiar about the work is how it blends English mythological past with inherited literary traditions, most notably being classical epics with allusions to Greek gods sitting alongside the prevailing Protestant theology. It's telling that in an effort to launch a new kind of English literary tradition, Spenser still draws upon international sources, making something new from what came before. This eclectic approach, not shying away from the foreign to bolster the native, is equivalent to what Genesis are accomplishing in Selling England. On a lyrical level, the band's densely referential text strings together a fluid microcosm in which to tell a story spanning different eras and genres. Musically, this album saw more collaboration between the band members on individual songs than in previous albums, taking inspiration from their peers in moments like Firth of Fifth's guitar solo, which mimics the grandiose sound of bands like King Crimson. Rather than letting any one member dominate and therefore shape the album's vision of England, the band's collaborative process produces a rich and varied portrait of the nation's cultural identity. A view that the nation's culture was being sold by the pound implies that there is such a thing as a permanent English identity. Genesis recognise this irony. In a way, their very referencing of different parts of English life for the sake of making a commercially available album would make them complicit in this supposed sellout. Rather, they seek to show how the survival of the country's culture in the face of rising commercialism depends on a constant renegotiation of historic motifs with new ideas and outside influences. The portrait of England they are selling is full of contradictions and irony, because England itself is, even 50 years after it was released.